Welcome to Excel Smart. Today's project is If Clean, Then Excel. 12 tips for getting data into Excel. What we have today is a blob of data. Having failed to import it directly into Excel, we're gonna load it into Excel the old-fashioned way. We're gonna use artisan techniques here. You can slice and dice your way to clean data. Couple of principles of Excel Smart videos. First principle, we're gonna be presenting these techniques and tips in the context of a project. By giving a narrative arc to what we're doing, that will make it a lot easier to remember it. A lot of Excel videos just put tips, there's blast you with tips, and we're not doing that today. Second principle for Excel Smart videos, we're gonna focus on practicality. We're not trying to maximize speed by using the absolute tip-top, state-of-the-art functions in Excel. What we're gonna do is we're gonna use functions and techniques that are tried and true. I'm not gonna present a technique if I haven't used it multiple times. If you have familiarity with these prerequisites, you're gonna have a better time today. So if you understand Excel functions, if you understand cell references, and have a basic understanding of copy and paste, you're gonna get the most out of this video. If you'd like a video on those topics, let me know. And I have to say, today's topic was not necessarily the most requested topic for the second video in the history of the channel, but I consider it to be a foundational video. A lot of these techniques I want to be able to refer back to, so I want this video up on the channel as we get going here on Excel Smart. Without further ado, let's get going. Is that kind of redundant to say that? Join me as I peer into the abyss that is this data. So this is XML data. It's actually larger than it looked. And this is an ASPX file type. So you need to imagine here is that I attempted to import this using the traditional data import functions, but that failed. Tip number 0 for today is if you are able to import data directly into Excel, and the way you would do this typically is going over to the Data tab in the Excel ribbon, going to either just click on, say, from text CSV or get data and look for the right type of file. If you can import data that way, do it. You're done. That's a much more repeatable way. It's much more error-proof. The point of today's video is to show what to do if that doesn't work. If you have been in a situation where you're trying to research exactly how to import data and you're not seeing what you need and you're coming to the Microsoft how-to pages and your brain just shuts off, honestly, I get it because I do the same thing. I would much rather play around in Excel sometimes than try to read what seems like a lawyer wrote a physics textbook or something like that. So jumping back over to this file, I've opened this in Notepad. Notepad is usually a good program to open files that look like this, I guess. Notepad++ can be useful too, but I prefer Notepad for simplicity's sake. To make sure that what you're actually signing yourself up for is doable is you have to look for a little bit of a pattern in the data. Tip number 1 is to look for a pattern. If you find a pattern, you can load it. Now the data we have here, this is supposed to be a table of meal selections for guests at a dinner. And if you look here, you wanna, for this type of coding language, you wanna skip past the beginning few rows here. You'll eventually see, and I'll highlight this on screen, you will see the data itself as it should be in tables, embedded inside all of this coding language. So for example, you'll see some emails, you'll see some meal selections, you'll see some phone numbers. The data is in this table. So we need to look for a pattern we're going to be able to leverage to actually get this data out. Those patterns might look like, say, the same number of characters between fields. In case what we're going to key in on here, I don't think there's a more sophisticated name for it, is these less than and greater than symbols. Anything that's coming from a coding language is going to have sort of a pattern to it because that's how computers can effectively read and process commands. So because we know this is an XML file and this was using some sort of coding language, we know there's a pattern in there somewhere. Just got to find what it is. We've nonetheless identified a pattern, so we're going to move forward. We're going to start slicing this data up. Our goal here is going to be to get the actual data that's supposed to be in these fields and distill it down to just that. For example, we want fish for this order for this one person to be in a cell. And we don't want any of the other characters here because that's not going to help us in our data table. All right, so now it's time to actually get it into Excel. What I always try to do here first, because it's the easiest way and it's worth a shot, is I try to copy and paste the data over. I'm going to Control A to select all. Control C to copy, and go over to Excel, and I'm going to paste this right into cell A1. The data is now in the workbook. It's spilled over from cell A1 to A2, and just to show here, so I'm going to start typing in B1 just so you can see there was no actual data in cell B1. It was just displaying it that way. So if I actually drag this function window, you can see that most of the data looks like ended up in cell A1, and some leftover data made it down into A2. That's not ideal, but it's fine. Now, if you're looking at this data, you might notice some strangeness here. So we do have email addresses, but all the names look a little funny. I've changed the names here to protect the innocent, and I'm actually going to go into a tip today We're not going to use this to get the data out, but I use this to prepare the project. Tip number 2 today is a controlled find and replace. So I'm going to quickly show how I did that by changing the email addresses for everyone in the file. I'm going to highlight both of these cells. I'm going to bring up the find and replace menu with Control F, and I'm going to go over to the replace tab. Now what I want to do in this instance is I want to change any instance where it says excelsmart.com, and I want to replace it with excelsmart.org. There's a right way to do this and a wrong way to do this. What you don't want to do is replace just the com with the org, because what'll happen is if you have someone named, I don't know, Commodore Johnson, it's going to change Commodore Johnson to Orgmador Johnson. What you want to do is specify as precisely as you can what you want to change. And in this case, I'm going to type in the full URL excelsmart.com and replace it with excelsmart.org. I am reasonably confident that nobody's name is actually rebranded as excelsmart.com, and this will work. .com may have been fine, but because we're dealing with coding language, you never quite know when there might be a .com somewhere else. For example, this XML file, a lot of the data and a lot of the text here at the beginning of the file, Microsoft Office.com, you don't want to necessarily mess with that data. So we're going to do excelsmart.com and replacing all with excelsmart.org. I'm going also to specify just within the sheet, that's the default option for Excel. You can do that within the workbook. If you highlight a selection of cells, it will only replace within the cells. So let's go ahead and do that. And it made 134 replacements. One quick throwaway tip here. It's not really a throwaway tip, it's a pretty nice one. One of my favorite ways to use the replace function is to get rid of characters that I don't want. For example, if I wanted to get rid of every space, I could do find and type in a space here and replace it with a blank. If I want to get rid of double spaces, let's say for some reason the file I'm receiving was there are double spaces after every period because the person learned to type in the typewriter era, I would replace double spaces with single spaces. And I can do this, and I can do this repeatedly to even get from, say, 6 spaces down to 1 by repeatedly replacing all the 2s with 1s. It'll compress it down into single spaces. So the find and replace tool is a very useful tool. In a number of circumstances, we'll be using it in Excel Smart tutorials. All right, so like I said before, the data is in Excel. Now we have to start splitting it up. We need to distill out the actual text that's supposed to be in the cells. Tip number 3 today is using the text to columns tool. Where you find this is in the data ribbon. You move over to data tools, text to columns. And what text to columns allows you to do is it's going to split out all this data that's right now sitting in cells A1 and A2. It's going to either do it by fixed width, that means it's going to count characters and do a split that way, or it's going to allow us to choose which characters signal the splits. Well, I guess it's delimited data, so we're going to use the delimited option. Go next. There aren't any tabs in here, and we're going to uncheck that just to make sure we're consistent. We're going to add our own character here to do the split on, and I'm going to do the less than symbol. I probably could do the greater than symbol. Either would work, but I'm just going to do the less than symbol for now, because after looking at the data, I didn't look at literally every line, but I can tell that there is a less than sign, at least one, in between every bit of data that we need to pull out of here. I'm going to hit next. This is where you would specify the formatting of your destination cells, which might be key and if you're, say, dealing with dates or something like that, but I'm not worried about that right now, so I'm just going to hit finish. Some phone numbers might end up as a strange file data type, but I'm not overly concerned right now, so I'm going to hit finish. The reason why I'm not concerned with that is because if a phone number goes in as a number versus as text, I could always clean that up later. Definitely gonna have to do a future video on number formatting in Excel. I'll tell you that much. All right, so now we have our data. It's split out into different cells, but it's a little bit problematic because it's on 2 lines. It is much easier to organize data in Excel when it's all in either starting from 1 row or 1 column. So I'm going to want to take the data here in row 2 and just move it to the end of row 1. You can do this in like half a second. And the way you can do that is not by clicking and dragging around and scrolling around. Tip number 4 today is using Control with the arrow keys. If I want to quickly select all the data in row 2, you see I currently have highlighted cell A2. I'm going to hold down the Control button, and just to demonstrate how this works, I can, while holding Control, can use the arrow keys to jump to the end of the row. So I'm all the way now in column BLK. I can go back and forth with the arrow keys. When you're holding down the Control key, the arrow keys will jump to the end of a series of either filled or unfilled cells. So I can jump around quickly. I can jump to the bottom of the worksheet by hitting down and jump back up I can jump up here. This is a blank cell. I can jump over to the right and then to the end. I can confirm this way that more columns are filled up in row 1 than row 2. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to now hold down Control and Shift. I'm going to highlight all of row 2. Sorry, I have to start at the beginning. Highlight all of row 2. Control C to copy. And I'm going to jump on over here. So up arrow, right arrow, Shift, Control, right arrow. Whoop, I don't need Shift. Do this again. Up arrow, Control right arrow, Control right arrow, lift up. I'm going to lift. I'm going to pull off the Control button. Just do right arrow. This is an empty cell. I'm going to paste it here. Now we have moved all of. Oops. I'm actually going to use the. I'm going to use the cut command. Get it together, man. All right. I'm in cell A2. I'm going to hold down Shift because I'm selecting and I'm holding down Control. I'm going to hit the right arrow to go now to the end of the row. I'm going to hit Control X because I want to copy this data and not leave any behind. I'm going to let go of Control and Shift, hit up arrow, right arrow, holding down Control now, right arrow to go to the end of the row. And let go of Control and hit the right arrow to go to the first blank cell. This is where I'm going to paste. I'm going to use the Control arrow to demonstrate this again. All of the data is moved out of row 2. If I Control right arrow, go right to the end. And it's in now row 1. And it goes back there. Now, one thing that's a little bit tricky with this data, because it got cut off, I actually have a cell in here that was not split at the right point, so I'm just gonna fix that. Here it is. Wow, I got lucky. I got there pretty quickly. This isn't the first take. This is the cell I began with. Going to copy this into here. This is how it actually read. I'm gonna delete this column here. Like I said, we're artisans working here with the data. This isn't packaging line level efficiencies here. All right, so now we got all our data in one row and it's split out where maybe not every cell is some text we're gonna use, but it's getting closer. We've split it out by every instance of the less than symbol. So what's next? Well, we know Excel has a text to columns function, but our data is already in columns. We wanna split out what's inside these actual cells, right? By using tip number 5, which is paste transpose. Paste transpose is another one of my favorite paste special functions. So we're gonna highlight this row here, holding down Shift and Control and right arrow. I'm going to hit Control C and just hitting left arrow and down here. I wanna paste in cell A2, but I want this data to go down in the column. So I'm gonna go up to the home ribbon, paste special, and this little icon here, that's paste transpose. My mouse is blocking it, but it says transpose, so I can either click this or hit the letter T on my keyboard. So I hit T, and there it is. So now our data is all organized. It's split. Every time you would have had a less than symbol, now it goes to the cell below it, which means we can do text to columns again. Keep it clean. I'm actually going to delete these columns, and I'm going to do another split. As we started to massage the data a bit, we're starting to see the data that we want to be in our table. We see it a little bit more clearly now. So for example, we have, this is a name that has, names have been changed to protect the innocent. This is a title actually. This is a phone number, this is an email, this is a meal selection, and here we have a couple blanks. So what we're gonna do is, if you notice here, right before the data is where we have a greater than symbol. So that's where the coding ends and the raw text begins. We're going to do text to columns again. I'm going to highlight column A and go to data, text to columns. Well, in the same steps as before, we have treating this like delimited data. But now, instead of splitting on the less than symbol, which there are none of those left, we're going to do the greater than symbol. Not going to worry about data types and finish. So after we've done that, it's actually very clear here what we're dealing with. We have name, title, phone. Those are the column headers actually. And then we start having the names and the meal orders, etc. We obviously want to get rid of all this other junk, and we don't care about these settings that are more like window sizes. And so we're going to use a technique that we used in the look up and look great video, which is effectively the filter and move on technique. So I'm going to highlight, I'm going to use Control Shift down arrow and arrow to the right here. I'm going to add auto filter to this range here. All right, so now that we've applied the filter, what we can do is we can filter and move on by moving only the rows in here that are actually coming through as the strings. So some of these strings, what's tricky here is some of these strings are blank, and that's going to be important. So let's not over filter here. What we're going to do is we're going to filter where anything in column A here says data SS type equals string. So we go back up to the top, we go SS type. If we highlight this all the way down to the bottom, copy it and move on, we now have a data set that is starting to look like it has the actual information we need. What we need to do now is we need to declare which column all of these fields are going to go in. And the way we're going to do that is with the if function. Tip number 6 is the if function. Now, the if function performs a logical test, and if the result is true, it'll give you one answer. If it's false, it'll do something else. So what I'm going to do here, just for this first cell, for example, I'm going to zoom in here so you can see it. Equals if cell B3 equals name, and give me a 1. Otherwise, give me a 0. Now it's giving a 1. If I drag this down to another cell, it's giving a 0. Because it's testing to see, is B3 equal to name? Now, that's the way you declare text and compare to text in Excel, is putting the text in double quotes. If you just wrote the word name with no double quotes, it would think you're trying to write a name function, and it would give you an error. And that's not what we want here. All right, so that's what we have. We have the name cell being called out as being in column 1. This is our column declaration. Well, what's next? Well, title should be in column 2. Cothro W. Alcubo, whoever that might be, that should be back in column 1. So let's sort out all the column 1s first. We need to look for more things to queue into what should be in column 1. I want to say if the cell to the left is name, that's column 1. Or I'm going to want to build another rule in place where if that one's true, it's also column 1. So we have to decide what that rule is going to be. So this is where finding a pattern again is going to be useful. So if you look down here, we're just going to highlight every instance where you have someone's actual submission. So what we have, we know we're looking for a name, title, phone, email address, dinner, guest, and guest dinner. So it looks like Cothro over here has a guest. If we go to Scott has no guests, so that's a bit of a blank. And same with Zufrauco, Mr. Vorvado. So what's a pattern that we can pick up on? Well, everyone has an email address in here. Not everyone seems to have a phone number. Not everyone has a guest, but everyone has an email address. So if we had a function that looked for an email address, specifically an email address 3 cells below and 1 to the left of where we're declaring the column, we know that should be column 1 as well. So we have 2 functions here. We're going to use the OR function because we want to look for either cell to the left is name or you found that email. But the way you find the email is its own function as well. Tip number 7 today is the find function. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to write a function. I'm actually going to wipe this out and I'm going to build this function around the find function because that's the most complicated one here. I'm going to say, I'm actually going to do this where we will find an email. The find function is a great way for looking for specific text strings within a cell. So I'm going to type in here find, and I'm going to be looking for the text excelsmart.org. And I'm going to look for it in the cell, like I said, down 3 and over to the left here. So because I'm in what should be column 1. It should be able to find the Excel Smart text in this field over here. And that's sufficient here. So what's going to do is if it finds it, it's going to tell us how many characters it took to get there. So starts with the 17th character of the string. But if I bring this function down, we have an interesting thing here. We have an error. So that's how the find function works. If it does not find the text you're looking for, it gives you an error. We know that this person's name should be in column 1, and their title here should be in column 2, which is, 1 to the right of column 1. And every time we have an error function going down here, you're bumping over 1 column to the right until you get to another instance where you have a result. That means you're in the new row. So what we need to do is have our if function handle for this. Because we're dealing with errors, what we want is the result of the if function to change based on an error. Tip number 8 is error handling in Excel with either the if error or the is error function. We know we want column 1 for every instance where it's not an error, and we want to increment the column when we find it. So we need to use one of 2 functions. The if error function takes a calculation and says, if the result of this is an error, then give me, and you specify the output. So for example, I could say, if it's an error, give me 0. What the if error function will do if it's not an error is it will just give you the result of the function itself, so 17. So let's see this one in action. The find function is giving us 17. So if we did if error and then the find function and say, give me a 0, if it's an error, it's 17 here and then it's 0 in every other instance. That's how the if error function works. Alternatively, we could do is error. The is error function in Excel is pretty simple. Cells, we know this function here results in an error. If we wrap an is error function around it, so we do is error and open and close parentheses, so this function's inside it, it's going to say true. If we do an is error function around one that's not an error, it's obviously going to say false. So that's how the is error function works. And we can do an if function in here where we do if it's true, say give us a 1. And if it's false, give us a 0. So by doing if is error, it's overwriting that 17 and giving us the value we want to specify. Depending on your situation, you may want to prefer one or the other, but that's how they work. We're going to write this if error function. And I'll explain how because I'm going to talk through this function as we build it. Tip number 9 today is the OR function. Remember how we declared column 1 when the cell to the left said name? Well, we're going to use the OR function to declare column 1 when the cell to the left says name, or when the find function found the email. The OR function works by entering a series of true and false tests, all of them separated by commas, and if any of them are true, the OR function is true. So let's build this function live now. We're going to have the if function that we had before, but instead of just looking for the name, we're also going to use the find function with the if error function wrapped around it. And we're going to write it in this cell here where it should be declaring column 1. If equals. If one of these conditions is true, either the cell to the left here equals name, or the result of finding the excelsmart.org text, so find excelsmart.org in this text, in this cell down here, and if that's an error, give us a 0. So if the cell to the left is name, or if the result of this function is greater than 0, give us a 1, because that's column 1. Otherwise, give us a 0. This cell now it's giving us a 1. Here it's giving us a 0. If we bring this back up to the top, gives us a 1 up there because name meant one of the OR criteria. We're going to double click this down to the bottom. All right, our column 1s have now been declared. Now we need to get into column 2 and 3 and 4. How do we know which column we're in there? Well, we're going to use a technique I like to call the rolling if technique, and that's tip number 10 today. What we do is every row down here, instead of throwing a 0, if it's not the first column, it's the column that was declared right above it plus 1. So if that function, we can drag that up and make that function for the whole column. You see it goes down here and we go down to column number 7 and then it goes back to column number 1. One of the criteria for this being column 1 was hit, and then every time that fails, it's incrementing by 1. So it looks like we've done a good job of declaring columns here. If I highlight column C, we use the status bar at the bottom and show that no column declaration goes above 7 because that's the max number in this range. That's pretty good. So what we're going to do, we're going to start to deal this data out into columns. Like we're a blackjack dealer. We got 7 players. We got columns 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And what we want to start doing is using the if function here to sort it out. So for example, this name, the word name, should be showing up in column 1. So we need to do an if function. And what we're going to do is if this column declaration equals the column we're in, then we want this to be the data that's in column B. Otherwise, leave it blank for now. The way you do that is with double quotes with nothing inside them. So you see it said name. Now we want to drag this down, so we have to use absolute cell references to make sure when we drag it down, we don't start referring to the column we're in as this blank cell right here. So we have to use absolute cell references. Absolute cell references were covered in another Excel Smart tip, which is linked above. That was a part of the Look Great project, so check that one out. If you need to, quick primer on absolute cell references, but we're gonna just punch them in here if you wanna just keep going. For cell C3, we want this to say in column C, when no matter where this function is, as we drag out to the columns to the right. So we need to hit the F4 button to toggle until it says $C. We want row 3 to change, so we don't need a $sign in front of that. For cell D1, we want to toggle this to stay as referring to row 1, which is where our column, the column we're in, is located. And then for B3, we always want to be pulling the data from column B, so we need to toggle the absolutes until we have the $sign in front of column B. And we hit enter. Now if we drag this out to the right, we're in here now, and now if we double click to drag that down, we can see the entries for all the different rows here. So wouldn't it be nice if we could use one of the techniques we've used before, the filter and move on method? What we can do is we can use another rolling if technique to make it so that the last row here, or really the last column, depending on how you're looking at it, has the field that was most recently called out above it. That means this would be a complete row of data. We're going to use another rolling if technique by saying, instead of a blank, if you're not in the right column, just grab the data that's above it. Because you see what'll happen is now this will stay as name until it changes. And then if we go to the right here, it'll do the same thing. It'll pick up the right entry until you have a completed row here in row 7. See, it's grabbing the zeros. That's actually why I was sneaky here. I put the column numbers up at the top. and left this blank in here just to make it read a little nicer. But you can see row 7 here is a completed row. And if we drag this down, we see we have a completed row here in row 7. We have a completed row here in row 7. We got a couple zeros because this person had no guess, but that's okay. Now we just need to find a way to copy this over and copy and move on, or filter and move on, right? Now, tip number 11 today, sometimes you just need a helping hand or a helping column. This column's pure function is to allow us to filter on the completed rows. So I'm going to helper filter. How do I know if this is a row that needs to be copied? Now you got to be careful here. We can't be looking for anything specific in these cells because we can have a number of different entries. It's not clear if this is 0. It could be the end of an entry if there's no guest, so we can't look for zeros. What we should look for is if the next row below it is row number 1. So for example here, we'll put an if function. If this cell, which is, you can see 1 row below it and all the way in the beginning, equals 1, then we're going to say include in double quotes. Otherwise, we're going to leave it blank. And we drag this up. This helper column is going to be the secret to us filtering this data and moving on. We actually already used a helper column here in this column declaration. You could say all of these are helper columns. Helper columns are often the best way to simplify a challenge in Excel, especially when you're going through Excel acrobatics or something like we're doing now. I can't tell you the number of times I've used the helper column or helped someone who knew a lot in Excel but didn't quite know how to get the job done, or was spinning on what to do, was about to write this complicated macro. You just put a helper column in there. It's a good way to avoid, if you don't like nesting functions, sometimes helper columns are useful for that, so you can see every step of the calculation more easily. So if I filter now, and every time the word include shows up, I have effectively my data table is right here. Look at it. There it is. So I'm going to highlight this. I'm going to select it, and I'm going to move on. So I have what looks like a pretty good data table. I want to be able to scroll around this table. No matter how wide the rows are, I can see the name of the person I'm talking about. And no matter how far I scroll down, I can know what column I'm in. Tip number 12 is freeze panes. The way to pull up freeze panes is you go to the View ribbon, and you go over to Window, Freeze Panes. What you want to do is you want to select a cell where the top left corner is basically the intersection of all your frozen points. So if I want the top row to be frozen, I have to be selecting in row 2. And if I want the first column to be frozen, I have to be selecting in column B here. So if I do Freeze Panes, and you can see it shows you in this icon, the blue is what's going to get frozen, although what you select here is this first white cell, oddly enough. Now you can see as I scroll down, the header column is fixed, and now if I scroll to the right, the names are fixed. Now I can, without losing track of where I'm at, I can pretty easily see that I think this data table is where it needs to be. Some of these zeros I might go and delete later. I can actually format, this is another callback to look great. I can format as data table, so I'm going to do format as table. We'll go with this interesting bluish tealish kind of today. Now we're cooking with gas. The data has been cleaned, just like the fish that Zawatho Voxor has ordered. And that brings us to the end of today's project. This was If Clean, Then Excel. Again, if you have any project ideas you'd like to see, let me know in the comments. I'm happy to get to them. Hope you enjoyed today's project. If you want to get really good at Excel, subscribe to Excel Smart. I'm going to be putting everything I know and use in Excel on this channel. That's it for today's tutorial. We'll see you in the next one. For anybody that provided some feedback after the first tutorial and tip videos, thank you very much. That honestly saves months of just experimenting. I'm incorporating everything that I can. Column 1.